This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word. Hey, well, welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer Courtney, Timothy Knotts, and I discuss books from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. Today's Wednesday, July 24th, 2024, and I'm Lee Bortons. Today, we're also joined by Stephanie Meter, one of our Classical Conversations multimedia curriculum developers, and her mother, Lisa Bailey, one of our lead curriculum developers. You're known by your fruit, and Lisa, your fruit is amazing. I love both your girls and now all your grandbabies. So
Oh,
welcome to the
thank you.
show.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So Timothy, tell us about this month's shows.
So this month we're exploring some of the great Challenge 1 literature in our curriculum. Over the past few weeks, we've had some great conversation about The Sign of the Beaver and The Witch of Blackbird Pond, both by Elizabeth George Spear. And last week was The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Today we get to explore one of the great, really iconic pieces of American literature, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. And next week we'll get to dig into Johnny Tremain.
That sounds great. You know, something that other books all have similarly when you read them, you could have been reading about some British colonial eras because there was a lot of still British ideas around those time periods. But To Kill a Mockingbird is such an explicitly American piece of literature. So it's going to be fun to talk about today. So if you're interested in any of the books we've been referring to, you can access any of our archived episodes on my YouTube channel at Lee Bortons, or you can go to my website, leebortons.com, to click through to them. And also, if you want to know what's coming up in the future, you can go ahead to leebortons.com and click on the archive and purchase any books that we're discussing from classicalconversationsbooks.com. So Timothy, let's get started.
All right. So since Jennifer's not here today, I get the privilege of asking the iconic first question. Why, Lee, is To Kill a Mockingbird part of the Challenge 1 curriculum?
Yeah, so, I was thinking about that. It just was a favorite of mine when I was a child too. And then when I was researching what kind of books would we want in a classical education and what did schools that claim to be an IB, International Baccalaureate, read, and what kind of books are read by, day schools that have a reputation for reading great literature. And then what was on the list of various universities of books they expected to see young people applying to their institutions to have read. And To Kill a Mockingbird came up a whole lot. So that made me really happy to know that a book that I love so much, collided with the rest of the world and saying, yeah, it's a pretty good book. Everybody should experience reading it. Something that's also interesting, besides it being very much an American book, is Harper Lee, who I'm sure you'll tell us more about in a minute, Stephanie. But to have her only write one book and have it be so good makes it so that I can say to students, you might not have 10 or 20 books in you and consider yourself a writer, but what if you just had one good one? Don't give up. Look at what you can do with it. And look what this book has done to help us talk about so many important issues in the American experience. So it was just a great addition to all the other books we're reading.
Yeah, like you said, Lee, there's some really particularly American themes in it that I think are great for us to explore. So you also brought up that at least for a long time, To Kill a Mockingbird was Harper Lee's only novel. And we do know some one-hit wonders in music. We talk about those sometimes, but in authoring, that's maybe a little less common. So especially when the first one is such a success, there's a great temptation to just keep writing more novels. So Stephanie, you want to share a little bit about Harper Lee? So maybe we can figure out some things about why it took her so long to write that second book.
Yeah, so I found a quote about why she said she never wrote again. And she said it was for two reasons, or she never wrote again for a long time after To Kill a Mockingbird. She said it was for two reasons. One, I couldn't go through the pressure and publicity I went through with To Kill a Mockingbird for any amount of money. Second, I have said what I wanted to say and I will not say it again. So And I think she did say a lot of things really, really well in To Kill a Mockingbird. So she based the book partly on some loose experiences that she had when she was a child of her friends and family in Monroeville, Alabama. Her father, as a lawyer, actually did defend two Black men who were accused of murdering a white storekeeper, and both clients were hanged. So she has some personal experience watching her father try to defend some people. She won several different awards. In 1966, she was appointed to the National Council on the Arts, which isn't an award, but it's a very prestigious position. She was later in 2007 awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her contribution to literature, which is the highest civilian award in the United States. And then in 2010, she was awarded the National Medal of Arts. So that was for outstanding contributions to the excellence, growth, and support and availability of the arts. So she wrote this one book, really out of, it kind of came out of a different novel she thought she was going to be telling. A couple of months after she passed away, the book Ghosts at a Watchman was published. And To Kill a Mockingbird was born out of the flashbacks of that book. So the flashbacks of Scout were so compelling and so much fun to write that she actually decided to write that as her full story instead of writing the current or something that happened like 20 years in the future story. And I think we're all really glad that she did that. One other interesting tidbit that I found out about her as I was digging around a little bit is that her first name is Nell, Nelle, and is actually her grandmother's name backwards. So that was what she went by in her day-to-day life, even though she published under
Oh.
Harper Lee.
That's really cool. I never knew that.
That's fun.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah.
So every story element, we've spent a lot of time over the last year or two exploring story elements. All of them are important, and all of them together, of course, make up the story itself. But in this novel, we're going to spend a little time looking at both setting and character because they play important roles in the story. So let's spend a couple minutes just talking about the setting. Maybe each of us can share one or two things that we either think are important about the setting there and make them, or maybe something that you think was particularly memorable. Lisa, do you want to start us off?
Sure. One thing I was thinking about the setting and the time, and obviously it's written and set in a sleepy little southern town, and there are lots of ways that you can tell that it's a sleepy little southern town because as she describes what's going on. I thought it was really neat and telling that the story it's about summertime. So the kids are free. They wander around and they get into this, that, and the other thing, and they have plenty of time to explore the town and what's happening in the town and what it might mean to the town. And it allows them to, of course, to have Dill along with them because he's visiting for the summer. And I just think it kind of, I don't know, little southern towns in the summer have a certain cadence. The things that happen have a certain cadence. And I think that it's really well suited to the way that Harper Lee tells the story. It just kind of unfolds in a slow, but I don't want to say ponderous, but slow, but certain direction. And it seems to lend itself to what happens and to the way she tells the story.
That's good.
I
Something that
enjoy
I've
part
always
of the aspect of the summerness, I think, as well, and that the kids are allowed a lot of freedom, and part of that is the summer, I think, and part of it is the place, and part of it is the time. It's set in the 1930s, so the children were allowed just a little bit more freedom in their small town, and so there's not always a lot of adult supervision. There is an appropriate amount, and they have a lot of adults in their lives that pour into them. But the setting is such that they are free to explore ideas and places on their own, which lends itself to a lot of fun lessons for them.
Mhm.
Yes, some of the settings are super unusual in the book, for moderns to think of as children, wandering in the courthouse in the last third of the book and spending their
Yep.
days there. But, and throughout there's this theme of this tree where secret
Yes.
surprises are left. What kid doesn't want a secret tree where some mysterious person's leaving things? And so that's very interesting to them. But one thing I think about a lot in that book was food, because they were in the kitchen where the maid there, the
Mhm.
husband's a widow, so there's a maid who's taking care of the children a lot, and so they're in the kitchen talking and eating her food.
Yep.
And then because she's a black maid, there's that transcultural issue, so they know what kind of foods she and her family eat because she cooks them for
Mhm.
them. And so just, and then I think about how it's a town because it's so sleepy, where there was no restaurants, and modern people would think, well, that must
Right.
mean they never ate out. Well, they probably ate out more than we do, because they would have potlucks on Sundays and picnics during the week,
Uh-huh.
and dad would come home for lunch and sit
Mm.
on the porch and eat. So there's just all the elements of just quality family life
Mhm.
against the stark story itself.
Mhm.
Yeah.
In the whole setting, there's so much community. There's
Mhm.
so much involvement with the neighbors, right? And then the small town. And even at the end, well, in the courtroom scenes, all the people in the gallery know those children, and they know people are known by their families. And so being part of that family defines you in a certain way. And that's what happens in little southern towns. Who
Yeah.
are you? Who's your daddy? Where'd you come from?
Yeah, I was going to point that out too, Lisa, that there's that being known, even if they don't know you individually, they know where you come from. They
That's right.
know who your family is. They know what kind of family you're from. And so they know what to expect from you. Like I think about the description of that one family where the kids come to school for about the first day or maybe week of the school year because they have to, and then they never show up again to school for the
Right.
for the rest of the year. And that's what they always do, and that's what they've always done, and that's what every generation of that family has done. Um, and everybody knows it. And there's no surprise, right? It's just that's the
Right.
way it is.
Right.
Good.
And I think there is something both as more modern and not small southern town family, there's something both wonderfully comfortable about that and also something uh, a little bit terrifying about everybody knowing everything about you before they meet you.
Yeah. You can't hide.
All
Well, it
right.
seems like it was a comfortable thing for young children. And what makes
Mhm.
it uncomfortable for a maturing child into adulthood is they want to know who they are apart from what the community thinks about them. I mean, who am I really? And so that's
Mhm.
where I think people like to say it's too small a town for me. But
Right.
you don't get that sense in this book because the children are young.
Yeah. Yeah. They don't do a lot of prejudging, although they do know all the things, right? That there's an acceptance and yet an openness to
Mhm.
learning something different. Um, Well, let's on that note, let's turn our attention and talk just a little bit about some of the wonderful characters that Harper Lee sort of weaves into this setting. So there's many characters, of course, but there's a few that stand out. So I'm going to list a few, and then maybe if you all want to pick one to introduce to us, that would be great. Of course, there's sort of the two protagonists, Scout, who's the main character, who is sort of the narrator as well, and then Jem and their father Atticus, Tom Robinson, Mr. Yule, and Boo Radley. So would you like to start off with one of those?
Well, I'll be happy to. There's so much to say about all of them. I didn't want to steal anybody's thunder, but you can't separate Scout, Jem, and Atticus from each other. They are their own characters, but Scout's a little girl, Jem's her little bit older brother, and Atticus is their father. And of course, like we said earlier, they're younger, and saying things from her older self as the narrator, but almost always from her father's perspective. Every now and then her childhood creeps in. And so Jem is protective of Scout. Scout, they're both curious. Scout's best friend is this little boy named Dill, who Harper Lee portrayed after Truman Capote, another great writer who she was friends with. And the three of them, the three children, have a lot of adventures together, always knowing they're safe because of Atticus.
Mm. Good. I think Atticus is the dad that a lot of people not so much wish that they had, but they look to try to see their own father in Atticus. You know, he was he his wife had passed away, so he's raising these children by himself with the help of his housekeeper Calpurnia, and so he does the best he can to raise these children and be both father and mother to them while he does the important job of being a lawyer in this small southern town. He tries to live as a man of honor, and he tries to pass on that those qualities, those virtues of honor and honesty and bravery and doing the right thing, even in a hard time. And he seems very unflappable. I mean, no matter what happens, I never get the sense that he raised his voice. I mean, they did a lot of things that would have raised my voice as a parent. And so he just seems to be this very calm voice of reason and honor.
Yeah. But I want to add too that you get Tom Robinson, who's the so-called criminal that the case is against. You get that same feeling about Tom
Yes.
Robinson, that he's the black version of Atticus in this
Yes.
story. Honorable man, and that's why him going to trial is so much worse because he's such an honorable person. And I wonder how much Atticus thought, if we'd been born to different parents, could have been
That's
me.
right. That's right. Oh, that's so truly. I think they were both loath to draw attention to themselves. They didn't have to be the center of attention. They knew who they were. They knew what their place was, and they were content with that.
And they both sort of get in trouble in a way for trying to do the right thing, because
Yes.
Atticus, so Tom Robinson is accused of raping a girl or a young woman named Mayella. And the way that he even came to be in to her home was to help her with something. He saw that she'd been having a really hard time with her house and her family. Her father, Mr. Yule, was cruel to her. And Mayella needed help with something in her house one day and asked Tom Robinson for help. And so he went in, maybe against his better judgment, knowing that it could look funny, but he really wanted to help this poor young woman. And so he went in to help her. And that is how he is accused of raping her, by going in and really trying to help her out, just putting himself in a situation. And Atticus, in a different way, puts himself in a situation where the townspeople can be in conflict with him, because Atticus defends the innocent Tom Robinson at trial, and the townspeople give Atticus a hard time for doing the right thing as well.
Well,
Well,
both
that
of them have
leaves-
so much sympathy for Mayella. They feel sorry for her, even though this horrible thing's happening.
Right.
That leaves Boo Radley, who's sort of the mystery of the story, right? At least the first half of the book or so. A lot of the action centers around Jem and Scout trying to figure out what's going on at the Radley house, and have some great sort of very almost Mark Twainy kind of adventures as they explore the neighborhood and get caught or nearly caught doing some things they ought not be doing to try and figure out the mystery of the Radleys. I don't want to say too much because that's one of the real delights of the book, is to discover what is going on with Boo Radley. But he's the you almost want to say that it's a side adventure or something, right? It's it's an interesting parallel track story, but I think it's so much more than that. And so it's worth exploring as you read the book yourself.
He's
Um,
the kind of neighbor that every little kid grows up wishing they had,
or imagining they have.
It's the kind of neighbor that lived next to your grandma. And you always wondered, are the stories true?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I grew up
Good.
in a neighborhood that had the peacock lady, and I think that's why I was drawn to Boo Radley. Her yard was a jungle of chaos and all kinds of just plants over junk. And we lived in a nice neighborhood. So how the HOA let her get away with that is beyond me. But that was the door we would knock on and run, and that's the door we'd take flashlights to at night and try to see in the windows. Like we just wanted to know because she had peacocks in the backyard. So who's the peacock lady? So without giving Boo Radley away, it was kind of that analogy. The kids just wanted to know, it's something's
Right?
funny at the Radleys. What is it?
Yeah. It's a mystery. So, all right. Well, it's time for our break. Lee, can you thank our sponsor for us?
Be happy to do that. So I want to thank classicalconversationsbooks.com, where the books discussed can be purchased. We have the entire 2024 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leebortons.com with links to the classicalconversationsbooks.com site. And then I want to remind you, go ahead and go there because next week we're going to be talking about Johnny Tremaine, and it's a longish book, so you might want to get a jump on reading that. It's one of those kind of books we'd like to recommend to families to have their children read in the summer because they're going to have a lot of work when it comes to challenge. And so, and then it's that book's such an American icon too, even though it's about a bunch of colonists. So I look forward to that next week.
Yeah, a lot of good themes in that one too to explore.
Mhm.
So the second half of our time together, we always like to try and get into the text and not just talk about it. So again, I sort of already just referenced the fact that there's a Mark Twain-like part to the story. And like a lot of Mark Twain's writings, some of the charm of To Kill a Mockingbird comes from its style, the way that the story is told, along with the story itself. So, Stephanie, do you want to read some of chapter 1 for us so we can get a little bit of a feel of the story and maybe see how it is that Harper Lee guides us through Scout's perspective?
Sure. All right, so here's some from chapter 1. When he was nearly 13, my brother Jim got his arm badly broken at the elbow. When enough years had gone by to enable us to look back on them, we sometimes discussed the events leading to his accident. I maintain that the Yules started it all, but Jim, who was 4 years my senior, said it started long before that. He said it began the summer Dill came to us, when Dill first gave us the idea of making Boo Radley come out. Maycomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. In rainy weather, the streets turned to red slop, grass grew on the sidewalks, the courthouse sagged in the square. Somehow it was hotter then. A black dog suffered on a summer day. Bony mules hitched to Hoover carts flicked flies in the sweltering shade of the live oaks on the square. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning. Ladies bathed before noon after their 3 o'clock naps, and by nightfall they were like soft tea cakes with frostings of sweat and sweet talcum. People moved slowly then. They ambled across the square, shuffled in and out of the stores around it, took their time about everything. A day was 24 hours long, but it seemed longer. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with, nothing to see outside the boundaries of Macomb County. But it was a time of vague optimism for some of the people. Macomb County had recently been told that it had nothing to fear but fear itself. We lived on the main residential street in town, Atticus, Jim, and I, plus Calpurnia, our cook. Jim and I found our father satisfactory. He played with us, read to us, and treated us with courteous detachment. When I was almost 6 and Jim nearly 10, our summertime boundaries, within calling distance of Calpurnia, were Mrs. Henry Lafayette DeBose's house next door, house 2 doors to the north of us, and the Radley place 3 doors to the south. We were never tempted to break the boundaries. The Radley place was inhabited by an unknown entity, with the mere description of whom was enough to make us behave for days on end. Miss Du Bois was plain hell. That was the summer Dill came to us. Early one morning, as we were beginning our day's play in the backyard, Jem and I heard something next door in Miss Rachel Haverford's collard patch. We went to the wire fence to see if it was a puppy Miss Rachel's rat terrier was expecting. Instead, we found someone sitting looking at us. Sitting down, he wasn't much higher than the collards. We stared at him until he spoke. Hey. Hey yourself, said Jem pleasantly. I'm Charles Baker Harris, he said. I can read. So what? I said. I just thought you'd like to know I can read. You got anything needs reading, I can do it. How old are you? Asked Jem. 4.5? Going on 7. Shoot, no wonder then, said Jem, jerking his thumb at me. Scout yonder's been reading ever since she was born, and she ain't even started school yet. You look right puny for going on 7. I'm little, but I'm old, he said. Jem brushed his hair back to get a better look. Why don't you come over, Charles Baker Harris? He said. Lord, what a name. It's not any funnier than yours, Aunt Rachel said. Aunt Rachel says your name's Jeremy Atticus Finch. Jem scowled. I'm big enough to fit mine, he said. Your name's longer than you are, but it's a foot longer. Folks call me Dill, said Dill, struggling under the fence. By the end of August, our repertoire was vapid from countless reproductions, and it was then that Dill gave us the idea of making Boo Radley come out. The Radley plays fascinated Dill. In spite of our warnings and explanations, it drew him as the moon draws water, but drew him no nearer than the light pole on the corner, a safe distance from the Radley gate. There he would stand, his arm around the fat pole, staring and wondering. The misery of that house began many years before Jem and I were born. The Radleys, welcome anywhere in town, kept to themselves, a predilection unforgivable in Maycomb. They did not go to church, Maycomb's principal recreation, but worshipped at home. Mrs. Radley seldom, if ever, crossed the street for a mid-morning coffee break with her neighbors, and certainly never joined a missionary circle. According to neighborhood legend, when the younger Radley boy was in his teens, he became acquainted with some of the Cunninghams from Old Sarum, an enormous and confusing tribe domiciled in the north part of the county, and they formed the nearest thing to a gang ever seen in Maycomb. They did little, but enough to be discussed by the town and publicly warned from 3 pulpits. They hung around the barber shops. They rode the bus to Abbotsville on Sundays and went to the picture show. They attended dances at the country's riverside gambling hell, the Dewdrop Inn and fishing camp. They experimented with stump hole whiskey. Nobody in Maycomb had nerve enough to tell Mr. Radley that his boy was in with the wrong crowd. One night, in an excessive spurt of high spirits, the boys backed around the square in a borrowed flivver, resisted arrest by Maycomb's ancient beadle, Mr. Connor, and locked him in the court outhouse. The town decided something had to be done. Mr. Connor said he knew who each and every one of them was, and he was bound and determined that they wouldn't get away with it. So the boys came before the probate judge on charges of disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, assault and battery, and using abusive and profane language in the presence and hearing of a female. The judge asked Mr. Connor why he included the last charge. Mr. Connor said they cussed so loud he was sure every lady in Maycomb heard them. The judge decided to send the boys to the state industrial school, where boys were sometimes sent for no other reason than to provide them with food and decent shelter. It was no prison and it was no disgrace. Mr. Radley thought it was. If the judge released Arthur, Mr. Radley said he would see to it that Arthur gave no further trouble. Knowing that Mr. Radley's word was his bond, the judge was glad to do so. The other boys attended the industrial school and received the best secondary education to be had in the state. One of them eventually worked his way through engineering school at Auburn. The doors of the Radley house were closed on weekdays as well as Sundays, and Mr. Radley's boy was not seen again for 15 years.
So what is it about that setting or description that is so memorable and makes the story come alive?
So I appreciate about her writing is that she doesn't say to you that it's after FDR's in office and World War II's going on. She says instead, we've been told there's nothing to fear but fear itself, which is a very famous line from that time. So the author assumes we know things, like why would you get the best secondary education at the state prison and things like that, that she doesn't explain stuff. She just jumps in and figures you're intelligent enough to know what's going on. And then meanwhile, these children, oh, Stephanie, the way you read Dill, that was so funny. It was just,
I
you were
could
funny.
see him. I could just see him.
I was going to say the thing that, oh, go ahead, keep going.
No, I'm done. Good.
the thing that I don't know if it's necessary. It's kind of setting, but I love the way that she does dialogue because you can just hear the little children's voices and their little accents and the indignation in Dill's voice when he's offended that he was being called little. I just think that's such a fun way to use setting in dialogue by having those accents and ways of talking.
I just think it's funny the way they describe themselves is so telling. When Dill says, I'm little, but I'm old, I mean, okay, so now I know what he's like. And then Jim, I'm big enough to fit mine. And so his name, and it's so funny. And you can just see Scout puffing herself up that she can read too. There's nothing special about reading. It just, and I like the way that she describes the town and describes the way the summer had progressed, and you get the feeling that that they, and maybe the whole town too, is poised for something to happen. You know, I loved it. By the end of August, our repertoire was vapid from countless reproductions. We had played all the things we could play and we're tired of it. And so now this idea that probably in May we would have known was not a great idea seems like the best thing to do. We're going to make Boo Radley come out, And so I loved it. The way they describe the families, you can just see the town.
Yeah.
I think it was really interesting that it's not the rabble-rousing boys that are the ones who have sort of committed the unforgivable sin of the community. It's the ones who don't come out and know their neighbors. It's the ones who don't go to church and they don't go to the coffee shop for morning coffee with the neighbors. They don't join the missionary society. They stick to themselves, and that's the ones who the community really has the problem with. The other ones, they kind of know how to deal with it, but they're not sure what to do.
Yeah.
That's good. And that contributes to the children being confused as to whether they should be afraid of Boo, or is he just this really wonderful mystery to go explore? And then I don't think I mean, was you reading it out loud, Stephanie? I don't think I really heard that paragraph before as well. Boo Radley disappeared for 15 years.
15
That's
years.
scary. That's scary. How mean was Mr. Radley? Or is this from a child's perspective? And he really didn't disappear. He just wasn't where they saw him.
Right.
You know?
Right.
That struck me on this reading as well, that I hadn't ever noticed before the part that Mr. Radley seems to play and what was wrong with his son. Because we don't have any indication before this strange isolation that Boo Radley was an outsider or was really struggled socially in any way. So there might have been seeds, but he was clearly out and about and part of society when he was a kid or a young teen.
Yeah.
And his father, out of embarrassment, confined him for years. And we see later that that's had a profound impact on him as a person. And so I think Tim's point is really good, that we need community. And one of the things that this book highlights is what goes wrong when your community falls apart or when you refuse to participate.
Well, in my household, we when we were reading picture books with the kids, we reference the golden page, right? The one where the picture that's on the cover is on the page that you're on.
Yeah.
And in chapter 10 of this book, we get sort of the golden page moment where the title appears in the text of the book. So Lisa, will you read to us from chapter 10?
Yes. This is so hilarious to me as I read it as an adult. Okay. Atticus was feeble. He was nearly 50. When Jim and I asked him why he was so old, he said he got started late, which we felt reflected upon his abilities and manliness. He was much older than the parents of our school contemporaries, and there was nothing Jim or I could say about him. When our classmates said, my father, Jim, was football crazy. Atticus was never too tired to play keep away, but when Jim wanted to tackle him, Atticus would say, I'm too old for that, son. Our father didn't do anything. He worked in an office, not in a drugstore. Atticus did not drive a dump truck for the county. He was not the sheriff. He did not farm, work in a garage, or do anything that could possibly arouse the admiration of anyone. Besides that, he wore glasses. He was nearly blind in his left eye and said left eyes were the tribal curse of the Finches. Whenever he wanted to see something well, he turned his head and looked from his right eye. He did not do the things our schoolmates' fathers did. He never went hunting. He did not play poker or fish or drink or smoke. He sat in the living room and read. With these attributes, however, he would not remain as inconspicuous as we wished him to. That year, the school buzzed with talk about him defending Tom Robinson, none of which was complimentary. After my bout with Cecil Jacobs, when I committed myself to a policy of cowardice, word got around that Scout Finch wouldn't fight anymore. Her daddy wouldn't let her. This was not entirely correct. I wouldn't fight publicly for Atticus, but the family was private ground. I would fight anyone from a third cousin upwards, tooth and nail. Francis Hancock, for example, knew that. When he gave us our air rifles, Atticus wouldn't teach us to shoot. Uncle Jack instructed us in the rudiments thereof. He said Atticus wasn't interested in guns. Atticus said to Jim one day, I'd rather you shoot at tin cans in the backyard, but I know you'll go after birds. Shoot all the blue jays you want if you can hit them. But remember, it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. That was the only time I ever heard Atticus say it was a sin to do something, and I asked Miss Maudie about it. Your father's right, she said. Mockingbirds don't do one thing but make music for us to enjoy. They don't eat up people's gardens, don't nest in corn cribs, don't do one thing but sing their hearts out for us. That's why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird.
All right, so we'll talk about the Mockingbird in just a moment. Before we talk about that, maybe let's talk for a minute about what we learn about Scout and Atticus and Scout's view of Atticus from this passage.
Well, and that's one of the things that makes the whole book hard, is because it truly is written from this very little girl's perspective.
Yeah.
And so when she says things like Francis Hancock, for example, like I'm supposed to know who that is, doesn't everybody? So, that kind of just innocence that is throughout it. And so then contrasting it with her dad, who seems to be like only innocent, he doesn't even do any work from her perspective, which is just not true. But I had a dad who grew. If you asked me what he did, I would say he sat in the living room and read. I'm sure a lot of us have fathers who used to do that, right? Tim, I bet you're one of those fathers.
Yeah,
So,
and I'm obviously clearly feeble because I'm almost 50 too.
I think it's really interesting because from a little kid's perspective, their parents are what they do. They're defined by what they do, not by who they are or how they think or what they believe. And so that's one way that you can tell this was written by a little kid. And it's also how at the end you can tell she has grown a little bit because her father is not just what he did or what he does. Her father is also what he believes and what he stands up for.
Yeah, there's the moment a little later when they discover that Atticus can shoot, and in fact is a really excellent shot. And they're sort of, the Scout and Jim's minds are completely blown by the fact that why wouldn't he be showing off this miraculous, wonderful skill so that they can tell all their friends instead of their father just being the one who sits in the living room and reads and goes to an office and not the drugstore to work.
Well, and he trusted the children would learn how to shoot the guns if they wanted to learn how to shoot the guns, because that's probably what he did, was learn how to shoot the gun.
Mhm.
You know, instead of saying you can't play soccer out in the cul-de-sac, you know, we got to go play where it's all organized and there's t-shirts and pendants associated with it. He just handed them the gun and said, go for it.
So that theme of guns, obviously there's some issues of power, right? The ability to make some either truly great or terrible choices that come along with a gun. And so that leads right into this bit about mockingbirds. And we're coming close to the end of our time together. So didn't want to miss this because this is really wonderful things to talk about. But why is it here that she weaves in this and highlights it as the title of the book, that it's a sin to kill a mockingbird?
I think it makes us consider other people or other things that are the way that mockingbirds are, and that they don't cause any problems. They just do things to try to help us. They don't eat up people's gardens. They don't nest in corn cribs. They don't do one thing but sing their hearts out for us. That's why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. And I think there are maybe a couple of other symbolic mockingbirds in the book, but Tom Robinson is one of the main ones, that he isn't doing anything to harm anyone. He's trying to contribute to society, and he is contributing to society. He's not doing anything to hurt anybody, which makes it, like Lee was saying in the beginning, so much worse that he's wrongfully convicted and wrongfully accused in the first place. He's not doing anything but making music for people.
Mhm.
Do you think to a kid there's any real difference between a mockingbird and a blue jay?
Maybe for that culture, Tim, like where are you getting at? Because those kids knew what those two birds were. If you go to most kids today and say a mockingbird and a blue jay, I don't even know if they'll know what bird you're talking about. So what are you thinking?
I don't know. I think maybe this is one of those moments when Atticus is trying to teach them that they both look just like birds,
Mm,
but one of them acts differently, and you
mhm.
need to judge between them not based on the fact that they just both look like birds, but by one that does harm and one that does good.
Mhm.
Mhm. Mhm. It's not just what you see from the outside, it's about what they do. Mm.
Stephanie, any closing thoughts before we have to wrap up for the day?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. I was talking about just this book at lunch to some people that we could talk about this for so long. I just think it's such an important book because it doesn't devalue children and their perspective. I love that it's respectful of Scout and her limited perspective as a child, but still shows how everything that you experience in childhood and the messages that are given to you are important and do shape you and do get through on some level and will help you to become who you're going to be. So it doesn't devalue children. And then it also just does clearly speak to adults, because the people who convict Tom Robinson are all adults with their own biases, and they let those biases cloud their judgment, even though theoretically as adults, they should be more mature. They should be able to be reasonable and compassionate and truthful, but they aren't. And so I think it's a call to respect children, and then also to check our prejudices as adults and be sure that there's not something that is getting in the way of our right thinking when we are called to make decisions.
Mhm.
Mm.
Respect people. Yeah, and Tim, I'd like to end with the audience knowing that both you and Stephanie are in a southern town that's hot in summer called Southern Pines, sitting under a live oak. I can see it giving you shade behind you. So thank you, team, for joining us from wherever you are. And I hope everyone enjoys this podcast, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.